Hi, I'm Wendy Gardner. I'm going to show you how to stitch a Makower fabric pre-printed advent calendar with lots of easy tips along the way.
This is what you will need: a Makower advent calendar panel, wadding 50 by 70 centimetres or 20 by 28 inches, backing fabric of the same size, navy blue and white sewing thread, iron and ironing board, dressmaking shears and pins. The printed panel has instructions on how to construct the piece as well as the pockets at the bottom. You cut along the straight lines to cut out the pockets. Some are in groups, some are individual, and you'll see that the dotted lines are the folding lines which you'll use later. Start by cutting out the main panel, cutting around the outside of the deep pink or the red border. Once you've cut out the panel, you can then cut out all the pockets. When you cut out the pockets, you'll see that some of the lines are solid. They're the cutting lines. Some pockets are in groups, some are individual. Next step is to iron the top edge under. So you turn it to the wrong side along the top line and just press it in place. In fact, whilst you're doing this, you need to do this for all the pockets. Whilst you're doing it, you can actually turn under the bottom edge and iron that too, because indeed you're going to have to do that later. So why not do it all in one go? Save a bit of time. Now to sew. Sew all the same colour pockets at the same time. You're just top stitching along the top edge to hold the turned under edge in place. And I sew all of the pockets together at the same time, just leaving a few stitches in between. And then you can just cut them apart when you're done. This is much quicker than doing them individually, and of course it saves quite a lot of thread as well. Then do the same thing again with the rest of the pockets. Again, sew them in a whole strip and then cut them apart when you've done. Now it's time to fold the pleats into the joined pockets. You fold the pocket edge, which is the solid line, into the dotted line in the middle, making an inverted pleat, and you pin that in place, and you're going to sew across the bottom in a minute. So once it's pinned in place, you can then turn that bottom edge up again, press it into place, and then press in the side edges as well. This can be a little bit fiddly, but it's worth persevering to get it right. And once you've got all the pockets folded with the edges nice and neatly tucked in, you're ready to sew them on. Place the pocket on the panel and you can see you just match up the printed pocket with the print underneath. Match the edges, pin it into place around the sides and bottom, and then it's ready to stitch in place. And every pocket has its own place, and on the panel will be the number to correspond with the number on the pocket. Once they're all pinned in place, you can stitch down the side, across the bottom and up the other side. And it's a good idea, if you've got the capability on your machine, to move your needle to the far right so you can stitch nice and close to the edge of the pocket whilst using the presser foot as your guide. When you get to the corners, stop with the needle down, raise the presser foot, pivot the fabric and then continue. When you get to the end, back stitch a little with the reverse button just to make sure the pocket's securely held in place. For the pleated pockets, you stitch around the outside in exactly the same way. So reverse at the top, down to the corner, pivot, and then you go along the bottom edge over the pleat at the bottom, holding it in place. Pivot at the next corner, up to the top and reverse again to secure the pocket edge. Now it's time to stitch between the joined pockets where the pleat is. So you open out the pleat and stitch along the dotted line. Don't try and start right at the bottom of the pocket because you could inadvertently catch the pocket sides. Start a little way up, about 1 centimetre up or 3/8 of an inch, and stitch along the dotted line to the top of the pocket. And again, when you get to the top, reverse stitch just to secure those stitching. Having stitched on all the pockets, it's now time to turn our attention to the backing fabric. But first I want to add a hanging loop. So I've actually cut a strip of fabric 3 inches wide and I've turned the short ends under and I'm going to top stitch them in place. It's almost the width of the panel. It's about 3 inches less than the width of the panel so that there's room for the seams either side. Press the long side edges to the back as well. And then you can place it onto the backing fabric about 2 inches from the top edge and centred across the width. Pin along the long edges, which you're also going to stitch along. Having stitched the first long edge, stitch the second, but this time push that little tunnel, that little pocket, slightly to the left so that it has a little ridge. That means when you put the batten in or the doweling in, it's got some space for it without distorting the front of the panel. Now we're ready to put the whole piece together. Start with the printed panel with the pockets on, right side up on a flat surface. Put the backing fabric right side down on top, matching all the outside edges, and then put the wadding on top of that. Pin them together at the corners, and then I find it's much easier to sew from the right side, so flip it over, pin all around the edges, and then you're ready to sew. Now's the time to use a walking foot if you've got one. A walking foot really does help feed the multi-layers evenly, so all 3 layers of fabric will go through nice and evenly. Make sure that you've got the bar on the foot over the needle bar so that it works properly. The next thing to do is to increase the stitch length, and I'm going up to a 2.8. You do this because you're stitching through thick layers. And then stitch along the guide mark on, you can see it on the back of the fabric where the darker fabric is at the edge. Stitch all the way round, leaving a turning gap in one edge. I've left it in the bottom edge, a turning gap of about 6 to 8 inches. Trim your panel all the way around, and when you get to the corners, trim the corners at an angle. I leave the opening area untrimmed so that it makes it a lot easier when you have to slip stitch that opening closed and you can tuck those raw edges inside. Before doing that, of course, we've got to turn the whole panel through to the right side, poking out the corners using a point turner if you have one, or a knitting needle will do the same job. Put it all the way through. And then once it's all through and the corners are nicely turned out, you can press it. Press so that the seam's on the very edge, and press carefully so the pockets all stay nice and flat. The last job is to slip stitch that opening closed.
So there we have it, the Makower advent calendar all stitched and ready to hang.